week, ladies and gentlemen, we have been talking about the different informational text structures. Today we're going to talk about another one. We're going to talk about compare and contrast. And to get an idea for compare and contrast and how we might organize it, the first thing I want to do is I want to create a compare and contrast T-chart. So we're going to talk about the similarities, we're going to compare, we're going to talk about the differences, we're going to contrast a house and a nest. So raise your hand if you can tell me a similarity between a house and a nest. Yes, sir.
A house is where you live in, and like birds make their own nest to live in.
So it's a thing that people live in them, birds live in them. It's a place to live, right? Okay. Place to live. Okay, other similarities. What is the same between a nest and a house? Yes, sir.
It's where like a family could be raised.
A family could be raised there. Okay. All right, anyone else? House, nest?
Do you build them?
They're both built. Okay. Any other similarities we can think of between a house and a nest? Okay, what about differences? Someone tell me a difference between a house and a nest. Yes, ma'am.
The nest has
So they're made of different material. Okay. All right, what other differences do we have between a house and a nest? Yes, sir.
a house has different parts to it. It has a roof and it has walls, and the bird's nest is mainly just sticks and twigs.
So a bird's nest is kind of like maybe like a single room, and a house kind of has like multiple areas. Okay. All right, anyone else? Differences?
Like a house has furniture and a bird house just has sticks and twigs and so it doesn't like count.
Okay, so a house is furnished, and a bird's nest probably doesn't have a lazy boy in it. All right, do we have any other ideas? Yes, ma'am?
A house is big and a nest is small.
A house is big and a nest is small, right? All right, so I think you guys are getting the idea. When we use compare contrast, we're going to look at both things that are the same between the items we're comparing, and we're going to look at things that are different between those. So in informational text, this is one structure that can be used to organize our information. So let's talk a little more about that. It's my fancy PowerPoint for you. So compare and contrast text structures. Comparison and contrast are ways of looking at objects and thinking about how they're alike and how they're different. So for instance, I've got some pictures up here of all different food items. So they're all different types of food, right? They belong to different groups though. Some must be cooked before eating. Some can be eaten raw. So when we write comparison and contrast, we're going to pay attention to these kind of details. Although these are all foods, they may fit into that overall category. They also have a lot of differences that we can contrast. So why do we use the compare and contrast text structure? There are two main reasons that people use compare and contrast. The first is to explain. So you might compare and contrast kinds of food. For instance, you might want to help someone to understand which foods need to be refrigerated and which can be stored in a cabinet or on a counter. So it might be an explanation. You could also use it as an evaluation. You might compare and contrast different kinds of food to show why one kind of food or brand is better than another. So we could maybe compare and contrast apples and butter. What's the same about apples and butter? Yes, sir. They're solids. What else?
They can both be eaten raw.
They can both be eaten raw. Okay, what's different about apples and butter?
Butter is, the picture you have up there, butter is a rectangle and the apples are a circle.
So the shape is different. Okay. What about health-wise? Which one's better for you?
The apples.
Apples, right? Apples are butter. Apples are butter. Apples are better. So we might use that. We might use compare contrast as an evaluation if I'm writing a paper about what's healthier. I might compare and contrast those two things and talk about those things. So how do we use compare and contrast effectively in our writing? When you choose items to compare and contrast, first you need to make sure that the items that you choose have similarities. So if I chose to talk about a truck and crayons, would that make sense? Am I going to find a lot of similarities between crayons and a truck?
No.
What about a truck and a birdhouse? Would that make sense? Am I going to have a lot of things in common to talk about? What if I wanted to compare and contrast pencils and crayons?
Yes.
What's the same about pencils and crayons?
You can both be used to write.
They can both be used to write. What's different?
One is like a color and another is just like bland.
One's just lead and another's color, right? But those things would make sense to compare and contrast because they have similar qualities. They're things that kind of go together. What about if I wanted to compare cars and trucks? Would that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
What's the same about cars and trucks? Yes, sir.
Trucks are usually fixed directly on the cars, and the cars are left to push around and stuff.
But you ride in both of them, right? They're both transportation, yes?
Same brand of
Is it-
company?
They could be the same brand, that's right, true. Okay, what's different about them? Yes, sir.
Some are bigger than the others.
Trucks are probably bigger than cars, right? You're not gonna find a whole lot of cars that are as big as a truck. Any other differences?
Some cars will be faster than
Cars might be faster than trucks. What about the purpose? The purpose of them, yes, ma'am.
Like, trucks are to like carry like wood, a ladder and stuff, and cars aren't supposed to like carry that kind of stuff.
So trucks, generally, their purpose is probably gonna be to carry stuff, right? To transport stuff, and cars are more to transport you, right? To drive around in? Okay. So that might be some comparisons that we could make that would make sense. So let's talk about comparison. When you compare items, you're gonna look for the similarities or the things that make them the same. So, for example, let's say we were gonna compare and contrast apples and oranges. What could we compare? What are the similarities between apples and oranges? Yes, ma'am. They're both a circular shape. Okay, yes, sir.
They're both fruits.
They're both fruit. Anybody else?
They both are healthy.
They're both healthy. Okay, so that would be how we would compare. We would focus on the things that are the same about them. What about contrast? When we contrast something, we're looking at their differences. So let's take the same example. We talked about apples and oranges and how they're the same. What if we wanted to contrast those things? What if we wanted to talk about what is different about them? What could we say? What's different about apples and oranges? Yes, ma'am.
different tastes.
They have different tastes. Okay. Yes.
You have to peel an orange and you can just bite an apple.
You have to peel an orange. You don't have to peel an apple.
They
Okay.
grow in different places.
They grow in different places, right? Okay, so oranges grow where it's kind of warm, right? And apples grow where it's a little cooler. So let's talk about real life. You probably use compare and contrast all the time in your daily life, whether you realize it or not. So let's say I go to the store and I want to buy some candy. Now I'm looking at all the candy that's available, and I need to narrow down what kind of candy I'm going to pick. So sometimes we can use compare and contrast to make decisions. So I got my little smiley face up here making his decision. It's a hard one, candy's good. So if we were going to compare these types of things in a real life situation, we could start by looking at the candy. And maybe there's a certain type of candy that I like, right? Maybe I like chocolate. So when I go and look at the candy, maybe I'm going to look for things that are the same because they're chocolate. Or maybe I like sweet candy. Maybe I don't like sour candy. So I'm going to go and look for the candy that's sweet, right? So I've got a candy corn, a chocolate, and jelly bean. Somebody tell me what's the same about those things. What might I compare about these things?
That like are not all too healthy for you.
They're not healthy, that's true. Yes, ma'am?
Have sugar.
They all have sugar. Okay. What else might I compare about these? Yes, sir.
They're all candy.
They're all candy. Okay, so those are things that we can compare. Although they're not the same thing, they do have some similarities. What about contrast? If I wanted to look at these candies and I want to decide which one I want, I want to see what makes these candies different so I can make a decision on what I want. Maybe some of the candy is chocolate and some is not. Maybe some is hard candy and some is a little softer. Maybe I like candy that has a filling. Have you guys ever had those Rolos with the caramel in the middle? Yeah, maybe I want something like that. So maybe I'm feeling generous and I want to share some candy. Is there a certain kind of candy that is more prone to sharing, more easier to share with other people than others? Icebreakers. Okay, so we can see some differences, right? What if I wanted to compare a chocolate bar and a Jolly Rancher? What if I wanted to contrast those things? What's different about those? What could we say if we wanted to contrast
One's
those?
harder.
One's hard.
They both have different tastes.
They have different tastes.
They're both made out of different ingredients.
They're made of different ingredients. So we can find some stuff, right? We can find some things to contrast about those. Okay, so let's look at another example. I brought in a couple things today. The first one, which I hope you've all read because it's fantastic, is a Harry Potter book. So I've got a Harry Potter book right here, and the other thing I brought, and yes, this is really mine, I really study this. This is my biology textbook from school. So if I have these two items, what could I compare? What's similar about these items? Yes, ma'am?
They're books.
They're books.
You can both read them.
You can read them both. They have words.
A lot of pages.
They have a lot of pages. Anybody else?
Every cover is only some illustration.
They have pictures on the cover. Okay. What if I wanted to contrast these? What's different about these books? If I open this textbook, what's different about this than Harry Potter? Yes, ma'am.
One gives you information and one doesn't.
One gives you information, okay, one doesn't. Did you have something? One's a little bigger than the other, okay?
One's fiction, one's nonfiction.
One's fiction, one's nonfiction, okay? Anybody else? What is the purpose? What's the purpose of this book? If I pick up this book, what am I reading it for?
To study.
To inform, to study, to learn. Am I learning from Harry Potter?
No.
I'm gonna learn some wizard stuff. It's entertainment, right? So that's something we could contrast these two different things. Okay, so when we look at the compare-contrast text structure for informational text, there's a couple different styles that can be used to write these. We've got whole-to-whole or block style. We've got similarities to differences, and we've got point-by-point. The first one, whole-to-whole or block strategy. In this structure, you say everything about one item, then everything about the other. For instance, say everything about the character, setting, and plot for a book, then say everything about the character, setting, and plot for the movie. Has anybody read The Hunger Games? Got a couple people have read it. So maybe I want to compare the book The Hunger Games to the movie The Hunger Games. If I wanted to do that in whole-to-whole or block strategy, what I would do is start by talking about the book. I'm going to tell you everything about the characters, the plot, the setting, about the book. That's going to be one paragraph. Then I'm going to move on, and I'm going to tell you about the characters, the setting, and the plot of the movie. They're going to be completely separated. I'm going to tell you about one entirely, and then tell you about another entirely. So if I go back to our first example where we were talking about the house and the nest, how might I write a whole-to-whole paper comparing and contrasting those things? How would I do that? What would I start with talking about? The house, right? And the different characteristics of the house. I'm going to tell you everything that I wrote on this about the house. And then what am I going to tell you about? The nest. Then I'm going to tell you everything I wrote about the nest, but they're not mixed together. They're going to be separate. So I got a little visual for you here for whole to whole. So it's going to be separate sections and paragraphs for each of the items we're discussing. So item 1 is here. Item 2 is next. So I'm talking about apples here. I'm talking everything about apples. Then I'm going to tell you everything about oranges, but they're separate. The next strategy is similarities to differences. In this structure, you explain all the similarities about the items being compared, and then you explain all the differences. So if we're talking about apples and oranges, I'm going to start by telling you everything that's the same about them. What did we say was the same? What can I put in the first paragraph in similarities? We said a few things, didn't we?
They were both fruit.
They're both fruit.
They're both round.
They're both round.
They're both solids.
They're both solid. So I'm going to talk about those things first, how they're the same. Then in my next section, I'm going to talk about how they're different. What might I say?
They're different things.
They have different tastes, right? They have different colors.
peel.
When you have to peel. So we talked about those things. So that's what we're going to do in the similarities to differences strategy. So here's an example, a little visual for you. The similarities between 1 and 2, like we just talked about. We're going to talk about what's the same about the apples and the oranges. And then in a separate section, we're going to talk about what is different about apples and oranges. The third strategy is going to be point by point. So in this structure, you explain one point of comparison before moving to the next point. So for instance, you'd write about the characters in the book and movie in one section, and then you would write about the setting for the book and movie in the next section. So in this strategy, they're not separated. We're going to talk about one thing and then another thing, and then one thing and then another thing. All the points, one after the other, instead of separating them out by either item or similarities or differences. So here's a visual for that one. I'm going to talk about my first point. I'm going to talk about the color of the apples and the oranges. I'm going to talk about the taste of the apples and the oranges. I'm going to move on to the next point and so on and so forth. So I'm going to pass out a compare and contrast toolkit for you guys. I want you to take a second to read over it and look at it. And it's going to give you some clue words that are going to help you recognize the compare and contrast format. All right, so if we look at this sheet I just gave you, on the left side of the chart, it's going to give us some compare words: same, both, alike, similar, compared to. These are going to be words that are going to give you a hint that we're comparing things. And on the right, we've got the contrast part. We're going to see words like different, but, on the other hand, instead of, in contrast to. Those are going to be your clue words that we're looking at something that is being contrasted, that's being, looking at the different things. Okay, so now I want to look at an example. I'm going to read you an example of a compare and contrast structured article. And while I read it, I want you to look at those keywords, and I want you to see if you can identify any of the keywords. Also look at the style. See if you can tell if it's whole to whole, point by point, or so